Chapter 8. The Botanical Gardens. Tommy and I eventually, due to our combined pragmatism, thought it pertinent to separate ourselves from the mundane potency of our meetings and reach out to each other's spirits in a neutral setting, a tranquil terrace within which our postulation patches could flower. We desired to find the best possible location to allow for a precise silence. The stillness was needed to allow for the most unplumbed thoughts to arise and be analyzed. I thought the botanical gardens would surely draw out the necessary awe from within the uncovered corners of Tommy's heart. I suspected that the undeniable magnitude of consciousness's clarity held within a botanical center would, in no minute manner, bring forth humbling awe. I also hoped the site contained enough balanced natural wonder and human refinement to remind Tommy of the juxtaposed inconceivability and obviousness of existence, and our special place in it all. I knew the natural composition was going to bring about a sense of revelation that would allow for new growth in his evaluation of commonality, the intricate uniqueness of biological specimens, and, by extension, of humans. From the bountiful flowering of the alluring avocado trees to the vibrancy of the lustrous lilies, the glory of existence had been and was to be again always overwhelming to me, this time realized with Tommy. The inextinguishable glow of the universal flame within all living and non-living things remained luminous in my ideations, Tommy enjoying my convincing of him. The continuation of my love of the delightfully dancing primordial marvels remained strong. Tommy agreed to be levered out from the comfort of my office, and so we went. Before we left the office, I asked him about his narrative, probing. The story you wrote was wonderful. It was so rich in the vitality of life. The truth has few times been so unencumbered by us. Do you agree with your narrator? A slight sense of joviality danced in his eyes. With the narrator's actions or feelings, he asked. Both, I quickly responded. Obviously, we simultaneously exalted. He sat for a moment in problematic thought, finally retorting, well, I suppose that he wanted nothing but the continuation of life itself, with or without him. This is true of the most fulfilled person, but also of the most deeply despondent and nihilistic men of men. This duality has always troubled me. I hope to express the powerlessness of human interaction with the fabric of reality. He lusted for the acquisition of control, of his mind and his environment, and both eluded him, overpowered him, overcame him. The real message imbued in his lesson is the importance of his life outside of his thoughts. No matter the trepidation or bravery shown while dancing with truth, it remains always a dancer. No matter what the dialogue with it may be, you will dance. It will make you dance. His smile grew and a flicker of hope flashed in his eyes. The flicker mutated into a deeply insightful laugh, resonating through us powerfully and urging me to follow. I laughed heavily and we made our way to the gardens. I drove us further towards the gardens as further discussion of the particulars within his story continued. When we arrived at the gardens, a wave of delight hit me. The clarity and purity of biology smacked me in the face as expected. I looked over to Tommy, his face expressionless. The gorgeous sights and smells infiltrated my senses as a great and splendid conquering of my focus. The trees stood robustly, coniferous, or deciduous, dense, or elongated, with Spanish moss, thick and tangled, clinging so cumbersomely along the branches of many a tree. The cracks and crevices lay finely gapped, filled with insects and arachnids, all playing a vital role in maintaining the voracious appetites of natural splendor. The soil, held by the unbelievably girthy earth, rich with devouring detritivores, spreading deep and wide, had no conceivable end. The air remained colossal, prodigiously impregnated with the reproductive fragments and fumes of the plants and animals, using the wonderful wind to carry out the righteous entropic exercise of prospering, of creation, of conceived moreness, our fantastic and frenzied growth. As if studiously reading through an unabridged academic work, Tommy stared plainly into the vastness of the gardens. His stare had not been stimulated as a shallow or unthoughtful manner outwardly expressed, rather, it had been called forth by a pragmatic and underwhelmed entrapment that required materialization. It was as if he wasn't allowed to enjoy it all, and so he remained unfazed by the sheer resplendence that engulfed him. I gingerly asked, so what do you think? He snapped out of his studious observance. I am amazed at the scale of the natural world, he replied, at the non-spurious natural selection that is at constant battle with chaos, and the general ignorance of these processes. The lack of gratitude beholden to the distractions of psychophysiology truly devastates me. How could such an abundant array of intricate systems and seraphic structures be paired with an unimaginably powerful consciousness that isn't dedicated to the embodiment of its greatness through the direct study of it? We all have been gifted with the ability to accept awe but unknowingly refuse it. Habitually, I replied with opposition. Why is this the thing on your mind? Why not only choose to be struck by beauty? You plead for acquisition of understanding, but why is elevated knowledge what you hold dearest? Why is the experience of beauty, the fulfillment of the senses, not enough to move you? Let it be enough for right now. He breathed a lofty sigh of relief. As he was released from the chains of thoughtful inquiry, a momentary lapse in defensiveness opened. His shoulders dropped and he smiled. I continued, soothingly saying, ease into the ocular orchestra all around you. It's free of charge. Relax and let the beauty of the natural world embrace you. Become one with the truth and light of existence. These trees, this ground, and the elemental makeup of it all is here, with or without you, before and after you, just like the river. You must choose the path that leads you to the embodiment of your essence, not only the exponentiality of knowledge. It became clear to me that a large proportion of Tommy's suffering was due to a lack of community. Isolated and desolate, the man in the mirror was his only comfort, and comfort he was not. I spoke more clearly to Tommy, my heart heavy, adding, the man that truly knows himself is his own harshest critic, a man that is familiar with all the faces of himself knows the lengths of agony and destruction he is liable to create and spread if his darkness was brought to fruition. The level of evil that lies within each face's action or inaction is no less immense than any single atrocious act thinkable. Those distorted manifestations of the true self, like hay within a bale, though only semi-subtle and fragile thoughts, can, after not too long, leave a lonely soul barren of moral virtue. The masculine self-expectation of great sturdiness then further isolates one's mind into an internal dialogue, free from lively, life-fueled disagreement. In the wake of this, complicated nuances, crying to be unentangled, lie stagnant or worse. This is a life unlived, unlivable. Though Tommy had his conversing with philosophical works, the authors had limits to the sharing of their own truest natures. Their shameful thoughts, surely subjugating the thinkable, remained hidden within the cavernous depths of their complicated poetic prose. Something must have triggered his isolation into the ensuing diabolical thoughts that floated so effortlessly through his mind, entrapping him within himself, no escape. What happened to Tommy? What is eating him? I pondered once again. My laborious excavation of wonder from his beautiful spirit was just beginning, always re-beginning. I huffed under my breath's whispered breath. His perplexing problem reminded me of a cognized piece of my father's preposthumous, paternal advice patch. My father had said, that is, heard and re-said, you, my boy, are not your thoughts, you are you. That message had led me to develop one of my best psychological works, multi-ideation follicle theory. Eureka shrieking, but in a polite, botanically correct manner, I eagerly explained my theory to Tommy. With poignant accuracy, in honor of my father, I presented an abridged version of the theory. The theory, I said hurriedly, crystallized, states that each person is morally ambiguous. Each person is neither good nor bad, holy nor evil, timid nor brave, rather, each identifying characteristic is a fragment of self. These fragments, or follicles, numerous and persuasive, represent not only a part of one's psyche but also the summation of the interactions into and through which each follicle has led the person, each interaction constructive or destructive, preferred or hurtful. The limiting factor on the follicle's dominance is based on the introductions, intermediaries, and outcomes to or by which these follicles are exposed or caused. To build on the claim of moral ambiguity, the theory beckons to the formative years of a person's life. The origins of the thoughts, or ideations, that lead to the solidified follicles, are most important. These formative years, with high levels of neural flexibility and simultaneous vulnerability abounding, see a rapid expansion and morphing of ideas and follicles. My theory also focuses on the acquisition of control by the lead group, the most powerful few follicles. Dark triad follicles, for example, need to be quelled consistently and constantly. Thus, the theory calls upon the structuring of parental and societal organization to embody the most structured and moral scaffolding, filtering of the negative follicles. The theory also calls for the freedom to expand and contract each follicle, build, and annihilate ideations and thus follicles. This evolution allows the most beneficial follicles, for self and community, to prosper. Hence, individual freedoms, rights, and sovereignty are paramount features within a society to allow for the success of the positive follicles flowering in truth. You can surely see the connection of this to transactional theory. Dynamic evolution, and note the fractality of us, calls for constant trial and error until the ultimate follicles can override the sludgy intricacies of the negative follicles. The theory compelled many of my Freudian associates to reduce the theory into a derivation of psychoanalytic theory. Though similar in scope, my theory had a distinctive resolve embedded within its formulation. Without countless hours of reading or therapeutic undertaking, anyone could become more forgiving of themselves and, with immediacy, grow more empathetic and less judgmental, inwardly and outwardly. This informed forgiveness alleviates a large amount of societal shame. With this unburdening, a fortified unity with all people becomes possible. Wow, I feel that I'm repeating myself heavily. Anyway. Tommy, do you follow? Tommy nodded, and with a confident expression on his face, he added, I like the addition of the alleviation from the shame of immoral action, reminds me of Kaczynski's work. I chuckled, and we moved on. I knew he needed time to analyze the entire structure of my theory. On we sat in silence, both of us clearly remaining ambivalent about the general direction for treatment. The identification and classification of Tommy's issues was just the beginning of the therapy. To aid Tommy with his inglorious follicle commanders, I had thought it best to share the theory. That was not my motivation to speak, but strong enough it was of a subsidiary to dull me into the lull of falsity that I said a thing for any reason other than to impress upon Tommy my insecure security, hopefully secret enough to at least keep him guessing. I knew that his overly bombastic approach to discourse would deem any clinical work flawed in more ways than one, and so I thought it best to allow Tommy to discover the theory by guiding his thoughts through a line of charged inquiries. That inherent independence of thought would preempt his refutations and allow for maximized cerebral satisfaction. I queried, Tommy, do you think you are controlled more subconsciously or consciously? It was obvious that Tommy regarded my question as too simple. He ambled through his response, saying, it is neither the unconscious or the conscious mind that dictates action, but rather, the combination of them, the beautiful duel between that menacing id and superego, battling for center stage, the fastidious eye of the ego, so remarkably selective. He paused and then added, the preconscious mind is usually the heavy lifter within the thoughts of the philosopher. To add my nuance, I'll say that a hyperconscious mind simply sees as in, thinks, visualizes, understands, bears witness to the process, live and malleable, destroying the virtues thought natural or good or evil or real or not just another transaction, let's say. I responded with a nod of knowing, clearly proud, thankful for his use of my previous theory in analyzing the newly shared one. The trees swirled in the breeze as a quiet moment of calm embraced us. So, I said, almost blushing, the center stage is dictated by a primary force. How could the ego be enchanted to such a satiating degree as to allow for the superego to be the front runner? This superego, and the lesser commanding id, of and by what are these things constructed and fortified? Slightly less subdued and phlegmatic, Tommy answered, depending on the lens your thoughts Tommy, more of your unique views. I interrupted. He nodded and continued, the driving forces are usually built through a series of interactions with the world, mediated by the ego. Your surroundings, in combination with your endocrinological reactions to the surroundings, create a blueprint for the least self-destructive path forward, as in the safest and most known, matching of one's own value, or self-esteem, by your definition I mean. Well, self-destruction is what the try to not be this type of self-destructive usually gets you, a life unlived, addictions and copes to cope, and on until. This tendency towards safety over growth is ubiquitous, with the fear of change increasing its impact, fear as a whole. I mean, these aren't exactly my thoughts. How could they be? As a less directly intentional probe, I asked, what if you could control the way your ego interacts with unconscious and preconscious ideations? What if, by understanding that you, as an individual, are separated completely from your thoughts and the actions you choose? Well, you did say you cognize the process, so you know. Then, why are you still bound to your identity as the truths you cognize? With a little more work and understanding, and truth, your chosen actions could become a direct representation of your cognition's strength simply contained within your you, not representation of the initial thoughts, and even those actions as not representations of you truly you. The drives that ravish your mental scape decide nothing. Quickly and in a frustrated tone, Tommy squawked, while this distillation and subsequent surveying sounds wonderful, it is this reasoning that condemns me to be further anchored to moral relativism and nihilism. By understanding and further simplifying mental processes, all who understand the workings of the mind as malleable can pick the lock of sanity and plummet into total meaninglessness. Perhaps your lack of reduction into a moral system reflects your own history more than it represents human productivity or truth. I sharply corrected him, imploring, perhaps this is your value system, your precognition, deriving meaning from complications rather than distillations. He snapped back superciliously with a quick, thank you. His arrogance called only for silence. While contemplating, I stumbled upon some interesting truths and made a note in my journal. I wrote, we know not of the contents of what truly drives men. A moment spent in awe can render, with some semblance of refined resolution, the intent of life. A man's code is the chariot to which his essence is yoked, riding into daily battle. Check preposition for yoked mark. A battle between righteousness and evil bears down, with the gravity of solar systems. Each man must find his way to the light. One may ask himself, why have you chosen this life for me? What debt is owed? In some unearthly injustice, the lessons of mortal existence, and the impetus of life, lay heavy upon our shoulders. Tommy seems to be missing this full context. In his own special perversion of meaning, his self-absorption clearly blinds him to the obvious truth that everyone's lives are furnished with plenty strife and difficulty. The expectation of alleviation as solution from his burdensome lot has driven Tommy to hate his life, the truest sign of a trying to be victim, also, a victim. As is true of most youths, an objective observation of truth is seldom accomplished by him. With lack of objectivity gleaming, the hatred of the self extends outwardly and pervades the idea of life itself. The most inward darkness, no longer condemned, is cleaved out of its cell and spreads cancerously. Tommy's lack of faith in anything intangible serves only to worsen the bleakness of his experiences. This perspective, brought on unjustly, has created a troublesome paradox. The magnetism to truth without faith lies fraught with danger. It is always the caveats that strike with most sincere acuteness. If we posture ourselves obliquely to the formulation that life will be more X or Y by way proof of some metaphysical metaphysic, then we are doomed. If there comes a time in which the existence of God, a life force, or some essence of eternality is proven by some rapturous phenomenon, life would soon return to simple anguish. Though there would be a moment of pure reverence where all in contact could bathe in the uniting and unjudging glory of truth, this moment too will become a memory. Though the metaphysical existence now would exist outright, the pain of the human form would still be constant. The correct and incorrect paths will all still be open to us. The plaguing side effects of life that have been corralled into a pseudo-nihilistic outlook will be more present than ever, for nihilism requires aim at moreness to resent something and be true, for to resent nothingness is silliness. Notice how not nothingness this idea in metaspace actually is, a truth in the big game. Hence, with a revived metaphysical aim, the hatred for this place and time experience would only grow by dichotomous rising. From heaven to earth, there would still remain work, you see. This post-reverent future, after the happen miraculous has happened, would be a more desolate and destitute place in fact, for, without faith, religious or secular, there is no hope. Without faith, there is literally no hope. With closed-loop synchronicity, hope is defined as the faith in something better, and thus faith is, at base, hope. The proof in any higher order power undermines the structure of hope, as faith becomes a secondary structure, unimportant to reality because the unknown morphs into the known. The truly powerful fret not over the fools who lack faith. This paragraph seems false. The fear of death is not solely due to the perplexity of the unknown. The unfulfilled desires of the will to power, the remaining possibilities of life, these things truly plague a soul. The fear of death lies within the missed potential of remaining life. A fully lived life needs no fear as the physical vessel's job is complete, the lessons of life learned, the fruits of one's labor planted, harvested, and engorged upon. This fear of death plagues few of the tenacious greats. Potentiality and forward thinking are the symptoms of this driving force within life. Men, entropy's worst nightmare, call upon the probabilities of life with firm disdain. The meaning of the lives of most men is found usually in the conquest of the randomness that torments their lives. Oh, the grace of almost full faith, for if we knew the paradise of consciousness outside of space and time, what a saline existence and resentment for this state of being we would, more so than ever, too easily become. I looked up from my note-taking to find Tommy, silent and still observant. I looked at him as he gawped up at his newest stimulation. His perception's inquisition had moved on to the most breathtaking weeping willow. His look was narrow in focus though. Tommy's eyes lay fixed upon a raven, his heart and soul rustling. I bumped him and asked, "Tommy, what is troubling you?" His forlorn face, still glued to the bird, grew darker. "That bird there," he whispered, so enigmatic, "it draws me closer and closer, it reminds me of Poe's poem." There was a large, jet-black raven perched so placidly on the bust of the weeping willow, holding something. He quietly murmured, almost speaking only to himself, "Is it Raven or the raven?" The wretched depths of his thoughts startled me. Surrounded by the most amazing horticulture imaginable, sunlight fancifully frolicking through the air, majesty untapped, Tommy had found the darkest proximal organism and, further, used this dark creature to remind himself of the most obscure morbidity. The thought of the poetic cynicism of Edgar Allan Poe, second to none, made my worrisome tone intensify. "Look at this Plutonian barrier between us and the raven's tree," he whispered, pointing to the hydration trough surrounding the swamp-dwelling tree. With no surcease, his daft depravity flowed, he began laughing, intensifying that pronouncement of a laugh each time the bird ate. I noticed late what the bird grasped within its talons, but there lay the lifeless chunks of a mouse. The raven, machine-like, tapped away at the fresh flesh of its late victim. With each tap, growing in urgency and turning more ungainly, the ravenous raven dismantled the core of the prey and granted no respite to any so unlucky as to watch. Tommy's uncontrollable laugh outpoured for some time, growing more ominous with each refueling inhale. The fit climaxed with him begging me to ask him about the status of the mouse. When I asked what was to be made of the mouse, I knew what was coming. With no obeisance to Poe's artistic expression, the transfer of energy through death, or even the beauty of the natural world, Tommy screeched, "Nevermore." With his face now glowing like some perfectly ripe ruby, he laughed animalistically. The remainder of the movement through the gardens was encumbered by my rumination on the dark clouds that seemed to shower Tommy with such ignominy. His universal disrespect and woebegone insolence were being contorted into the perfect storm for nefarious actors to manipulate and extort. That fuscous outcome was potentially to be evil incarnate, the most terrifying of denouements. I shuddered at the possibilities. He seemed pleased with my troubled expression as horror overcame my professionalism and marionetted my face. Walking about and out, just before we shook hands and left the scarred sanctuary, I noticed Tommy's smiling grimace. The wry smile was paired expertly with the show vulnerability as strength and comfort in control of his hands wrapped behind his back. Mature in his use of trickery, Machiavellianism had never been so clearly understood, perhaps unread even, but definitely, defiantly understood. Part of me suspected that an even greater than evil to be, fear let fly truth was true, that a most twisted individual already stood in front of me. Within my disquietude, Tommy's manipulative presence grew more powerful, imbuing him with the aura of overwhelming contempt, authority, and sorcery. Once we both had departed from the botanical gardens, I had some time for decompression and thoughtfulness. His connection between the gardens and the raven had a larger significance. The poem worked its way through my own dreary night, crowded with the inaction of reality but saturated by the dense calamity of my slice of sliced human thought. If the man, quietly possessed within his chambers, had total clarity and alignment within the halls of his own mind, then the tumultuous tapping, lamplit loitering, and eerie echoing of the raven would have been of little consequence. If the man, so beguiled and frustrated by the bird, was not so pugnaciously inclined to interact with the foul crude Corvus Corax, he would have been pleasantly lifted from his troubles. But rather, the man, wrapped in his lonely destitution and grief, called out to the late Lenore, so divine and saintly, to no end. His bellowing sorrow was cast broadly and loudly across the eveningscape, only answered by the continuity of the natural world. That poem, so entrancing to Tommy, was surely fascinating to him because the men in the poem mirrored Tommy by problem as proxy. Tommy had spent his young adult life in desolation, a repercussion of clinging to the ungraspable. Building on his suffering, Tommy had deviated from the pleasantries of the present and condemned himself to his past as it indomitably grew larger and more void-like. The most Stygian life had been lived. Tommy had little time left, it seemed, his whole life. I knew that dangerous extrapolation was an especially true risk for Tommy as he was far more inclined to violence than most. The more intelligent, well-read, and cognitively capable he became, the less he cared for people. With each new neural network built, piece of literature read, or skill obtained, Tommy distanced himself from any competition and thus grew in seclusion, pride and shame the same in accelerant quality. The loss of the kinship held within any relationship had lost its novelty, this was clear. Moribund was his exploration of despondency. The average man or woman became more foreign to him with each passing day. Tommy eagerly sought out personal growth but lacked the wherewithal to seek the surroundings to satiate his familial, social, and carnal desires. As a direct result of that deprivation, the unexplored traumas of his life, and the partially annexed PTSD symptomologies, had never been alleviated by incorporation or rebirth. Tommy had built a house of stone and concrete on a foundation of loose sand, more involved in the affixing of embellishments than in the sinking of its foundation. Like a dog chasing its own tail, or a person as society trying to act morally without God properly translated, materialized, realized, and accepted, Tommy grew more and more demoralized and violent in each iteration of rabid chasing of his life. I suspected that our kinship, incomplete but paternal in nature, was one of the only meaningful connections he had experienced in his life. Tommy's revelry in our relationship was made clear by his constant seeking of approval through appreciation of his intellect. His intelligence had clearly gone unnoticed before we had met, surrounded by the thickness of the distributed norm. I had to identify his trauma and establish a functional modality for spiritual and interpersonal growth before the autogenous devouring of Tommy was complete. There was a Goodman residing within that boy, present as it was, releasing his distinguished potential required a most scrupulous sculptor. David lay caged in marble before Michelangelo with less magnitude. For the first time in a long time, I began doubting my abilities. My doubt was emboldened by the grimace with which Tommy had fashioned his gaze. His intent, though not clear, seemed to lie mostly in the ascertainment as exudation into cognition, as registered action into memory, into rumination, into even writing this of visually shared overt pride in successfully handling me. The next session would be spent talking through his macabre interpretation of the scenic gardens. Before that, however, he decided to share with me a spoken word that he was developing. With no hesitations or platitudes, like some lead-poisoned Caesar, Tommy transformed his script from private musing into piercing proclamation. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be awe. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be awe. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Can't let them ever do me wrong. No feelings, but I'm in my feelings, Lord. Oh my God. Oh my God. Where is this pain coming from? In the hole I dug, but it isn't me who made the men. The men who had the plan. The plan to do me wrong. So, what are we doing here? I just want to disappear. With the dose, I heal. Instead, I'll just send up a toast with meals. But let life ride out for a minute. Got a sick joke won't last the moment. And I hope it is just enough to make me feel like Cloud 9 existed. Too close, I missed it. Mixed up feeling. Heavy side function, from frayed to fixed it, I guess that's the way it goes. Tears don't fall right if you've got no hope, except that feeling in the back of your eyes and nose and throat. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be awe. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be awe. And it's just a distraction I write. From the demons I fight, but when it's done and I'm back, I can seriously believe that I left a mark in the shape of art on this earth. Where my pain starts and in my heart of hearts, I won't be just another man screaming horror at the end of it all. Just like Kurtz, it fucking hurts. And the air I breathe sometimes feels as heavy as me. Not inspired to respire. So, a haze I see. As a sign of the times, just fall in line to the rhythm and rhyme, don't pay attention. And that's all, folks. Don't blink or you'll really miss it. What time is the time to leave? It's your time when your breath is the last breath you breathe. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be I. Dark Triad wants to try me on. Live in my head so much it must be calm. It must be nice. It must be awe. The lack of structured prose present in his newest artistic exploration stunned me. The free-form fluidity of the piece struck me as unguarded and vulnerable, a sign that I was becoming closer to him. Tommy's balanced review rang with clarity as he spoke to his own as our human truths with absolute transparency. Perhaps the grimace was misplaced, I wondered. His declaration was riddled with the undertones of potential wickedness that lay within him. That forthrightness showed me Tommy's awareness of self and helped ease me into a sense of hope. The boy knew that the savagery of colonial morality, emphasized by Captain Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, was not isolated to a few condemned characters of fiction. Rather, he understood that it lay coiled within the hearts of all men, especially his own. That boring truth surprised me for some reason, like it was a novel acceptance between us both, rather than a well-trodden truth. It was that connection to the shadow side that showed the impressiveness and even-keeled nature of Tommy's mind. He was able to separate the reality of his being and instinctual realities from the worthiness of his actions. Further, he remained earnest in his contextualization of his truths as ones of many truths of humanness. He was growing more able to be objective. That was a huge step forward for him. Tommy, at least leadingly artistically, had finally begun moving up from ignorant and self-centered thought. His ascension into a deeper realm of philosophically universal truths impressed me. I again didn't know why it impressed me, and so I felt awful for my, at very least, expectation of stagnation. I wondered in a worse way what that meant about me. In addition to his graduation from mediocre rumination, he was beginning to springboard into a more pivotal part of therapy. We were entering into a more personal and focused space. It was time to crack open the solidified sludge that had sedimented itself upon the goodness of Tommy. Like the glorious light of some race crepuscular, piercing through the scattered tufts of humid clusters, the presence of Tommy's loves and lusts were breaking through the layers of mud that had, his essence, encrusted. Once we had both settled back into our appointed areas, I asked, "Why do you feel that Kurtz is the man you wish most notably not to be at death's door?" A thoughtful and more than ever easy silence followed, another good sign that his intellectual barriers were falling. Once satisfied with his response, he calmly replied, "Kurtz is the antithesis of Western moral value. This Western moral value as a truth of truths is paramount. Everything we have is because of this structure. Everything we strive for is crafted through this lens. All that have died for the West have died for this truth. What Kurtz deemed to be artificial is at least artifactual, at least. At least it is what is necessary to keep the chaos of life at bay. The fight against chaos is the ultimate righteousness." His thoughts were heavily rooted in his own consternation, the systems that opposed the Western ideology seemingly whining with rusted rigidity in and around him always. I opposed his claim, replying, "Though the most developed features of the world lay within the bounds of Western ideological undercarriages, does this mean that the morality within and the historical realities held by such a culture were cardinal?" His response, ferociously fast, came with a spat of humor. "Your counterclaim used the word cardinal. The power of the term has only been sublimated by the Western universalizing religion," he hollered. "Also," he continued, now annoyed, "it is a silly question. Things happened, but did they need to happen like they did to happen? I mean, really, the boredom required to ponder such a thing boggles the mind, perhaps even boggles the mind enough to solve the first problem of said boredom. At least in realized non-pretending, we can actually think." I chuckled, hurt. In all reality, we agreed. As a classical liberal, I felt that there were few notable nodi from which the West needed lifting, except for those obvious enough to put a sheep to sleep. And so, after some back and forth on some more boring actualities and opinions was used clearly to prove that we were still being navigated by me, we moved on from the discourse. We shifted onto a game of Tommy's creation. The game was simple. The first player created a one-liner and the other player responded with a one-word, disproving response. Tommy, of course, wanted to be the first contender in the synthesis of incandescent one-liners. He spoke clearly and concisely, saying, "Freedom is not to accept the men must accept freedom." My response was one simple word, Soviets. As on the nose as it was poignant. The degree of freedom in which the West had bathed over the years was often taken for granted. Though Tommy understood the global historical theater, his philosophical lens peered only into, as out from, the truths of the West, formulated by a lifetime of felicity within the sonorous echo chamber of generally democratic free thought. The real catastrophic effects of control, the actual ability of men as government as force as self-manifest to materialize himself over others, manipulate and mold another, rather than simply accept and flower his own will over himself, had not been first-hand witnessed by Tommy in a political sense, only studied through texts and accounts. After some internal dialogue, Tommy registered the correction, and thanked me with a deep nod. He then waited anxiously for my retort. My one-liner came to me rather instantaneously. It was an altered quote I had fashioned from the crumbs of a famous Mark Twain quote. "Unfair comparison is the destroyer of joy," I proudly stated. My quote captivated Tommy for a while. Excitedly, I viewed Tommy's thought process. The usual ephemerality of Tommy's vigorous brow furrowing failed as rarely as ever as he took my quote on a comparative journey through his life, stopping at any feature that resembled a differential view, his marvelous brain fastidiously calling to action any recollections to formulate a rebuttal, refined rebuttal, a rebuttal challenging rebuttal, and another and all the workings as they marched on and on until a tempered, true enough, announced word could come. Channeling all his might, Tommy scanned through his Rolodex of memories and landed on nothing arguable. I was glad that I presented him with my morphed quote. The original quote would have been slain immediately by Tommy's internal logistician. The original quote from Twain stated, "Comparison is the death of joy." The inconceivable absoluteness of the word comparison called for a ready rebuke. Worthy and objective comparison of his direct causes and effects was the meter stick from which he, an existentialist, measured his past, present, and future actions. Thus, the change from comparison to unfair comparison was a necessary alteration made to stump Tommy. Content with the change in reflection of action, I continued my study of Tommy's face, hard at work. I could almost see what he was thinking. I obviously could not. As his brain fumed from the creation of thoughtful linkages, he gazed out through the window, glancing at a boisterously bellowing bird. Suddenly, as if possessed with the most pristine truth ever forged, he responded. "Stagnation," he exalted. I asked him to explain, and he did. From the wistful willow warble to the yearning yak, all living things are in competition. One reality rules over all things. Though this reality is unfair in the human egalitarian sense, it is present whether understood or rejected by us. All things fall within a hierarchy of being. The unfairness of the comparison, though assumed to be self-generated in your quotation, is inherent within the structuring of the universe and thus all that has spawned from as in it. Hence, there is no distinction between unfair comparison and comparison. The internal comparative thoughts need not be unjust in synthesis if the actualities in comparison are head-on, in other words, are actually unfair. Mass, might, and money as metric all pool without concern for us. For this reason, the destruction of joy lays within the rejection of any facet of comparison in truth, as unfair as it may be. It is merely a reductive act to simplify our cognition into a two-chain linkage. Rather, we must use the understanding of the unfeeling structure of this reality to relieve ourselves from the painstaking search for fairness by materializing it. The search for fairness, or the self-removal from the so-called unfair comparison, usually leads to one thing: stagnation as refusal by way forced ignorance, resentment foisted high, as total. For this evil that comes of full fairness-seeking, you can revert to your one-word response from round one, Soviets. Dumbfounded, I responded simply with, "Well done." Tommy smiled and gave me his newest quotation. "Rapturous death blesses those who fret not with trying to avoid it." Though a simple answer like accident would suffice to kill the full generality of the quote, it was a fine statement. It was clearly a thought that helped Tommy in understanding his suffering and accepting it. For that reason, I offered him a victory by leaving it uncontested and asking him to explore what he fully meant. Graciously, he recited what he was thinking, saying, "The same people who are always trying to be safe and not explore the boundaries of their own existence are the very ones crushed most by the prospect of death. The idea of annihilation, or even removal from the physical realm, is too painful to imagine for those who haven't lived fully. Their connection to the One, so distanced by their ego, lacks prodigious prowess and thus fear of death follows. There is no nobility in solemnity after all. As lavishly sweet as it is to bite the hand that ails you, squeeze a throbbing cuticle, or hurt the hurt itself, we may only stay fixated on suffering in these endeavors. It is the frontierman, the pioneer within us that frees us from dismay by way of departure. The destruction of life's possibility is determined, but edifying the plethoric possibility pool into life as, with and for you too, that is the truth of us as yous, the acceptance and allowance of yourself to create and play and celebrate in life and love, that's the zenith of life's greatness. With this nestled neatly under our belts, we die in peace. He finished this thought with a defeated exhale, knowing so much but able to actualize nothing but entrapment. I was happy for him, he understood the pathway to purpose. I hollered, very nice indeed. The session ended soon after, stained by my unsureness of how to better direct Tommy inwardly, to explore his own realizations, wars, and acceptances so that he could materialize in his own life the strangely nuanced metadoctrine, also known as original wisdom, that he had just so eloquently espoused. Tommy was a unique individual, his visionary prowess was so directly opposed to his solitary and unextraordinary life. He was trapped by his own thoughts and fears. Like a caged tiger, growing restless, especially in knowing the true grass and its great greenness all around, the viciousness of his will had grown mighty. The inner animal's lonesome experience only added to the danger of the ferociousness. I knew the world would be changed for the worse if it was unprofessionally, unlovingly, as some unintegrated force, unleashed by anything but proper help from me. To free the young maestro's heart and soul, I had to truly dive within his psyche and help jostle loose the painful losses and scars to allow for the dispersion of dirt to flow and the enforcement of empowering epiphanies to take hold. That incendiary process was going to take trust, a quality that took more time than anything else to build, especially with such a crusted creature as Tommy. It was Tommy who had first explored the notion of relationships and the detriment of disavowing the sacred nature of trust. He had mentioned it within one of our earlier meetings. He had said, "What do we have if we don't have trust? It is all that makes us human really, quintessential humanness, with trust firmly grasped, maintained, and cherished, only then may people journey through life together. With trust guiding us, the lost souls of each entrusted member will come to know each other as they know themselves. This deep enrichment only comes to those who decide to fully invest in truth and thus undeniable faith. This cornerstone conviction nucleates all that has been built and all that is to be built. What necessitates this ambiguous credence? What is the impetus hiding behind informed faith? It is the security that a person does not have to travel through time, in relation to the trusted member of their community, with uncertainty. Humans, mammals in general, are terrified of the unknown. Trust fortifies us against the uncertainty of the future, it allows for the security of the non-entropic ease of mind that allows for mapping and planning. With this ability to trust and be trusted, from young, instilled, prosperous thoughts and actions become generally effortless and natural with the right people. Without trust, how can the entropy be staved off? It cannot be held back from wreaking havoc on all within its path. Discomposure will take over and the perpetually next trustworthy groups and individuals will be decimated. This is the story of people, for as long as recorded time has been beating on humans to track its tempo and timbre, we search for truth. After all, what else is the famous fruit? Within trust, we find faith. Why cry out, why end a relationship over one broken promise? Ah, too clear it is that you offer up predictability no longer. This is connection, this is relation, this is love. We are a fractured shadow of divinity, and truth is our only hope for reunification. I found Tommy's truth rooting particularly positive. Implicit within it was an iron heart knowing and accepting the suffering for the betterment of all, hopefully himself too. I came to know of Tommy's relationships, he would describe them in detail to me. Tommy had no intentions to form or realizations of trust with any person he had come to know, even family members were all partitioned to some same island of mistrust. Tommy, so adroitly confined to keeping his true self to himself, masquerading as a lackadaisical and naturally gifted youth, was so hung up on his own life, that ever if truth found itself in the presence of him and a stranger, a potential destructor to fachadas, it would have to leave town after being pretzeled, spheterized, owned, such raunchy and raw abuse. Tommy knew of trust but knew not trust as true or faith as any meaningfully capacious but an emptiness filled by one's own work and self and isolation. The foundations of his own relationships were built on misdirection and masterful manipulation, that was clear. He wanted me as to the world to think that he arrived at mistrust and heard from an inward-out experiencing, that where he found himself was logical, self-truth-based, somehow reasonable despite the basing, but like an open book on fire and read aloud and converted to a movie and turned to a set of songs, all screaming out at once, he was just another traumatized human, resentful and running. Like the rest of the tested and broken postmodernists, he glared loudly. There is only everything, and humanity something rising, bouncing around and figuring it all out in between said something and always everything. He was hurt and alone and scared and ready to grow. Though few cared to notice the difference, he surely knew that his illusion only mostly hurt himself. It was the same affliction question of billions before him, as old as psychology itself. How can one trust another if one cannot trust oneself? Eventually meeting again, I prodded at the earlier greatness of life reasoning he had postulated by asking a few questions to isolate the truth of whether he thought his actions exemplified his theory or if he understood how he was missing the mark. The questioning landed with devastation, his posture slumping and his eyes narrowing. Caught in his some shrewd scheme, he took a mindful moment. Scrambling to join his thoughts and speech, confluence unforeseen, he began noticeably bouncing his heels in rapid succession. He most certainly knew that the same old tat-tangled truth that landed so easily upon most wasn't falling atop my weathered and inquisitive scope, and so he stiffened his upper lip and tried to stifle his bleeding heart. In a major segregation from his distinguished disguise, he demanded, "What an inane question. Isn't it obvious that I maintain the verity of my thoughts through my actions?" I implored him to calm down, gather his thoughts, and register my desire to aid in his healing. As if dreaming or writing some novel scene and refusing to fill space in a long chapter, already unclean, Tommy composed himself almost immediately and answered sincerely, rehunched, "I fear truth. Truth uncoils all. I am only fortified in the examination of truth, not in truth itself, my truth, as if that or anything else exists, for neither is surely truer than both simultaneously and at war for whole, refusing to dance but in truth and acceptance of." Another defeated exhale broke Tommy's reverent muse cluing. As if he were catering to my desires, he answered with such concise clarity that it took me a second to capture my thoughts and respond. He had cracked. After all his orchestrated contrivances had failed, he thought it best to finally be true to himself, me as the simple proxy for the necessity to be more than himself, his self. From his strength, he extended himself out to me. I could not let him fall from the heights of vulnerability through mismanagement of his truth. Frozen in my indecisive brooding, we sat in appreciation of his openness for a while. The session ended and I somehow suddenly found myself with nothing much to say but "thank you" and some other whatevers. I could not believe myself as I shook his hand, still unable to share a single profound ponderance. Accepting the moment, I loosened myself, along with my grip, a most uneasy calm deluging us both, the relief in our own knowing growing into more knowing of one another's knowing of said knowing and as now shared knowing and knowing of said knowing and stop, we both said, our eyes wide and black like pupils as whites too, all but a set of thoughts. We found sanctuary in minimal verbiage once again. Uncomfortable platitudes would have fallen upon deaf ears. As I returned to my car, and entered, I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and wondered for a moment where I was. I knew all of what I had just heard and seen, but my memory quickly faded. I knew everything and nothing, all at once. In a moment of ultimate confusion, brought on in no small part by Tommy's incredible distinction from normal thought, I began beating upon my steering wheel. As I bruised the sides of my hands against the wheel, I begged for answers as to how I could have found myself lost for words, lost for direction, and most of all, confused. He had spun me like a top, absolutely freeing myself from my cogency. Bang, into bang. I continued. I was being stripped, piece by intellectual piece. All my ineffectual toiling boiled over with a final strike of my hand upon the wheel. I winced with great and sudden, action-ceasing agony, the final forceful impact seemingly shattering or dislocating one of my carpal bones. As I writhed in agony, I subtly accepted my fate and tipped my hat towards the area where I had last seen Tommy walking from my office, the empty pathway administering more respect than his presence surely would have. I found and collected myself, accepted my defeat, started my car, and drove home somberly. The next morning, I arose to a seemingly normal hand, the healing rather unusual in its rapid onset. Grateful, I bounded out from my bed and tested the injury's limits. I knew it couldn't be fully returned to order and so started to bend my wrist, planning to test to half of its healthy, fully stretched capacity. The instant start to a true stretch came like an arthritic joint's last ride, its internal movement feeling like the sensation of chalk breaking between dry fingers, fuzz released sensationally. The shift break was like an ice cream bar, one squeakingly, sudden soft poppingly, crackingly smudging open. I continued nonetheless. At exactly 1/8 of its normal range of motion, I winced. At 2/8, I grunted. At 3, I moaned, and at halfway to normal, I cried out, "Of course." The wrist was injured but remained healthy enough to sweep it beneath my worried conviction. I leapt over to my closet and dressed myself, hoping that my exuberance would overpower the painful reality clinging to my arm. After 2 minutes of moving as masquerading madness, I went to place a sock on my foot. As I started stretching the fabric over my foot, my injured hand's tension tendons aligned swellingly perfectly along the mass of tenderness, stabbing my mind with painful signals. I curled over, sock half on, and held onto the hand tightly, hoping that the dislodged carpal bone would miraculously bound over from its false place and return itself to comfort. I cried out to each of my cells and begged for my release. With my grip tight, and my blood pounding up against my opposite hand as made tourniquet, my injured hand beat me mercilessly with pain. My pulse and pain rose perfectly proportionally, adrenaline like store-bought cocaine, even more useless than non-existent. After I had felt around and found no fractured or broken bones, I knew there was nothing to adjust. It was a simple sprain, a painful fruiting of passion. Anger and confusion had persuaded me to act with unrelenting irresponsibility, and so I huffed and puffed most of it all eventually away and humbly forfeited my hand. It was my concession. Though the reality of my situation was always to come of my explosion, and I realized this, I hesitated to accept it. Literally grasping onto the painful reminder of my mortality, I asked for remorse from the universe, begging upwards, please let it be gone by the end of today, just this once, for me. After realizing the girth of my crazed behavior, and the gall of my begging for instant release, I mournfully removed my mitt from the mad pain and released myself from denial. I drove mostly one-handedly to the pharmacy and bought a cast for my hand, the pain ebbing. I laughed at the closed loop that was to come of my misbehavior. I knew that the next time I saw Tommy, he was going to ask about my cast, and that I would have to approximate the truth of my angered bashing. A reckless admission to him, I thought with silly nerves, would be offering up a win too precious to offer. I dived deeply into indecision for the following days before our session, wondering whether to adhere to my medical training and wear the cast, or remove the therapeutic thing and move onwards. The fractured features of Tommy's mind were going to draft a most stupendous and daft outline for my destruction through this hand and what I did, oh what I had done, this hand, oh what I have done. These hands, oh what has been done. What have I done? Blood sun bellowing, blood sun writhing.